Greetings, everyone. I'd like to tell you about a journey we at eBay went on last year. Let me start by introducing myself a bit and explaining our situation at the end of 2020. So my name is Wyatt Webb, and I lead a team called Native Platform Engineering at eBay. This team is responsible for providing the platform, infrastructure, release, and observation for any team inside of eBay that wants to contribute code to the native mobile apps. We're responsible for the foundational code that everybody uses, the CI pipelines for PRs and the release building, the release management process itself, the post-release telemetry and observability for our customer teams, soup to nuts. Now, at the end of 2020, we were still releasing the native mobile apps once every 4 weeks, so roughly monthly. But a new initiative was about to launch to improve our ability to ship production software faster across all of eBay. Of course, this meant something different to those of us doing mobile development than those deploying services or web applications. But this is the story of how we pursued that goal and achieved it. So obviously we have to pick a place to start, but I'm actually going to take you back a little further for a story to help compare where we were. So let's go all the way back to the mid-90s when I was experiencing something very similar. So in those days, I was shipping shrink-wrap software on CD-ROM. Our development cycles were anywhere from 6 to 18 months with the classic crunch time in the last several weeks. We ran projects this way because a release was a big event. There was significant financial outlay for the company to duplicate and package the CDs. Fixing a bug post-release meant literally waiting until that first run had been sold through or eating the cost of those physical disks and then printing another batch. So this led to a mindset of having to get it perfect before you ship. We found a serious bug late, we would delay the release, work late to fix it. But when we delay, we would also find another improvement that we would now have time to squeeze in. As the complexity increased, the predictability decreased. The extra time wasn't actually improving our chances of getting it perfect. We just told ourselves that until we couldn't find any more P1s or until deadlines could no longer be moved. Does this sound a little familiar for some of you? Not too many years ago, the mindset about shipping native mobile app updates was not too different. Despite the fact that the cost of distribution is so small as to be effectively free. And remember, eBay doesn't sell our apps. We provide access to the eBay platform and make money by increasing the activity on the platform itself. Still, for the first several years of my time at eBay, we were releasing updates at a rate of about 2 per quarter with some of the same problems. These were big releases with significant changes. We pushed hard to get them right, even if it meant delaying the release date. And of course, as dates moved, folks eager to get their features out would want to sneak into that now delayed release because there was some extra time. As the complexity increased and the bugs seemed to keep coming, the push was to slow down even further to get it right. So here was our pattern and how we did things internally. When we were ready to release, we would cut a release branch. The theory was we could let the code settle down on that release branch while other development work was plowing ahead on main. Now, this process of, quote, settling down meant dev teams would flip on their feature flags and start testing all of their new work together for the first time. Now, teams started to optimize their testing time by waiting to do their validation on that release branch. And much of that validation was happening manually. So the natural consequence was that all the code that was on that main branch really didn't get a lot of love and was left in a perpetually rough state. Bugs were left to exist on main until they became big enough issues for release, and entire features would be hidden from other devs until they turned on their feature flags in a release branch. This vicious cycle that allows main to become less and less reliable and delays more and more work, giving the illusion that work is done because we're just delaying it until that release branch is cut. And even these release branches lived in 2 phases, right? So we would allow at the early phases of this release branch's life, we would allow bug fixes, and you'd have to get an exemption for anything bigger than that. And that really only sort of worked. And then in theory, near the end of this branch, when we were getting close to release, we would code freeze it. Every change needed an exemption. Again, that only sort of worked. So what's the plan? How do we attack this problem? So this company initiative I was talking about to ship software faster came from things we'd learned from books like Accelerate and folks that had joined the team with this DevOps mindset. And the whole point here is this really showed the provable value of shipping more often. There's actually scientific evidence here. Now, what clicked for me pretty quickly was breaking the assumption that you needed to optimize for perfection and why that was a trap. And this really matched what I'd seen during my whole career back from those CD-ROM days to even a couple of years ago. In fact, shipping more frequently means we can react faster. Being perfect is the fool's errand, and instead, let's be quick. By increasing cadence, we can fix bugs faster. In fact, shipping more frequently means smaller deltas. That means we are more likely to be able to reason about these changes and the complexities so that when we find a bug, we might know where that is. And in fact, shipping more frequently forces us to change some bad habits in a healthier way. And even more ironically, as we were analyzing this, we were even limiting ourselves in sort of a meta version of this same perfectionism. We'd start talking about the change, and there were many voices, including my own at times, that were describing how it just couldn't be done, or at the very least, we'd have to very carefully plan out how it would work. Of course, this just leads to sort of a analysis paralysis problem. Instead, we had to start asking, what would it take? And simply working through the actual blockers. And finally, we learned one important lesson, which is every time you ran into a problem in the process of why moving faster, harder, when you find a pain point, you don't back off, you deal with it, you address it. And that led to sort of this quote of, if it hurts, do it more, because you want to make sure you solve the problem. If you back off, you're going to ignore it. So how'd the trip go? Well, let me walk you through our progress. So we started out, 3 weeks seemed to be the limit. And so this is where we started in January of that year. The general conversation at that point was about shifting resources in a way to give teams time to build more automation, perhaps having some dev teams skip releases even, so that they could have time to get features to build them up. This time we were still seeing teams feeling very tied to particular releases. So a feature could go live during a particular quarter or because it was a link to a longer chain that had to land by a deadline. We were still getting a healthy stream of exemption requests for what could arguably be called feature work to be squeezed in simply because of the calendar math. Now remember, this is one of those patterns I talked about before that leads to a vicious cycle of complexity and delay. Then we moved to 2. Going from 3 to 2 weeks now removes 33% of the time between releases, and everybody's starting to feel this. The lifetime of a release branch now shrinks from roughly 17 days to 10. That's a whole week of regression and validation removed. Worse, it's too short to find a bug, report it, and have it fixed and merged inside the release window. Teams realized that they were depending on this turnaround to happen inside of the release branch window, and they couldn't do it anymore. We also noticed that our remote configuration policies were too slow. We had a policy of releasing with configs turned off, waiting for adoption to peak, then turning the configs on so we could see any problems separate from those what might have been release problems. But releasing every 2 weeks meant that by the time we could see a problem, another release was already on the launchpad. This was the final straw and following through with an idea we had tossed around for a while, turning the configs on by default and then only disabling them after release to mitigate problems. In other words, releasing hot. This allowed us to see issues post-release pretty quickly. And in some cases, we could spot them even as we were still ramping the release, and we could therefore pause the ramp. It had a secondary benefit of forcing everyone to turn feature flags on in the main branch much sooner. So interactions were noticed, addressed much earlier, and we were already seeing the release compression revealing long polls that we weren't aware of and natural adjustments to those we were aware of. While there were some rough edges, things were going relatively well. There was consternation about our plan to try weekly releases in September, so we thought we'd give it a test drive so we could get a peek at what new revelations would be found and what processes would break. We switched to our weekly cadence for the month of July and held our breath. The release branch still lived for 10 days, but it was frozen from the start in that code frozen state. Again, attempting to teach teams that the release branch is not where you do your work. Feature validation, regression, even integration with other domains should all be happening on the main branch. I think this is what finally forced some mind shift. Getting validation and regression done within this release branch window went from super hard to just illogical. People stopped thinking about compressing the existing process and started thinking about changing it altogether. That's what we really needed. So testing shifted largely to main. They weren't waiting for release branch to test. Configs were turned on when the feature was considered nearly ready to ship. We even started seeding releases to our customers a few days before the official release so we could see the really big issues earlier. So widespread crashes, service mismatch problems, things like that would show up really quickly with a minimal exposure to our customer base. Release day was no longer the first day of the seeding, but that was the day we went to 100%. And you'll notice that some of the way the math works out here, we had to make another decision, and that was the decision to overlap. So up until now, the releases were always simply stacked back to back. but during this weekly release period, they would overlap, meaning we would be creating the next release branch a few days before we had finished shipping the previous one. That was a little bit of complexity, but it was the window that we're trying to abide by. But that leaves you with the last step here, which is we wanted to remove the overlap too. So that meant shortening that window from branch cut to release. So the rule we keep even today now is that we create a release branch on Wednesday. We upload that branch to Apple and Google on Thursday. We start seeding that branch on Friday or Saturday to get over the weekend, which happens to be a peak period for us. And assuming all goes well, you release on Monday. This keeps administration simpler, and it actually reduces the opportunity for those exemptions I was talking about, or the one last change people wanted to sneak in. So that window gets really small. So are we there? We did it. What do we win? Well, one thing we win, obviously, is this faster iteration time, right? There's always an opportunity to get your code to the users quickly. There's never waiting a month, waiting a couple of weeks even. There's always another release going out next Monday. The delta from version to version becomes much smaller. So when problems do arise, when we do see bugs, it's easier to reason about that and isolate. Doing the searching through all of the PRs that got into that last release is a much more reasonable conversation. More testing on main is happening. Faster release cycles have led to fewer exemptions and less need for out-of-band releases, or what we call dot releases. In fact, we now have a new tool in our toolbox called scuttling. When a seed goes badly over the weekend, or even we find a bug too late in the process, we can actually choose to just not release because the window of opportunity is still coming, right? There's still another release the week after that. We're not kicking it out a year or a month or anything like that. In the past, doing something like scuttling a release would have been very dramatic. In other words, the quality has improved. We're slowly breaking the dependence on targeting a particular release. It becomes much easier to plan on going to the next release when there's another one only days away. And we took great pride in hearing a team report to us during this period that they would have to wait to enable a configuration because now the native clients were moving faster than the service teams, which had been a common complaint about our old release schedule. But we're not done yet. Still things to fix, still things to improve. Some teams still hurt. Some teams are still doing some manual regressions. And in fact, are creating their own little code freeze windows and want other teams to do the same because they tell us they cannot maintain a weekly cadence. We're working with them to help improve automation and move that work to the left. But there's still some education about why moving faster is better. And there's still this knee-jerk reaction to say, slow down, that'll be better. Now, outside of actual releases, we need to learn how to take advantage of this new cycle. So we've gone from fewer than 10 releases a year when I first joined eBay to fewer than 15 a year just a couple of years ago. And by the end of this year, we're going to get to nearly 50 in 2022. Now, this is a quantum leap in the ability of dev teams to iterate on ideas. Experiments on smaller changes can be run, reacted to, refined, and fully released in a month or less if you're quick. Detaching features from releases and allowing teams to ship when they're ready is a game changer. Continuing to design and deploy incremental value and smaller batch sizes. And guess what? We're also improving developer productivity. So we need to continue to help developers be more productive in this iteration time. So we're going to continue to work on improving PR time, improving local build time, so they can take advantage of these iterations. And lastly, we want to improve developer confidence. So when developers merge their code to main, we want them to be confident that their code's merged. So asking the questions of those teams that feel like they need a code freeze still, or they have manual regressions, what would it take to get that stuff in a state where a PR being merged is a state of confidence for you? So the hypothetical question I ask teams now is, could we ship a release right now? Or what would it take for me to get to a point where I could ship a release without telling you? That's the work we have to do. So looking back, what did we learn? Well, we learned you can move forward with less than complete information when you keep your eyes open and have a rapid feedback loop. So avoiding that analysis paralysis and being willing to actually start, because we learned a lot of things we never would have guessed, and a lot of things we were worried about never came to fruition. You will likely never be able to predict all the pain points correctly. You'll overlook some and plan for several that never be a problem. And you'll actually might find more value that you plan as you go along. And as I mentioned in the beginning, optimizing for perfection is a losing battle. When you think about that, bugs become exceptions in that environment and will break your process. But we all know bugs are normal. Instead, admit that you will ship bugs in certain amounts and optimize for addressing them quickly. Bugs are part of the process. And that's just the reality. Thanks very much.